Are you a leader navigating burnout, doubt, or growth? Welcome to the Ripple Effect Leadership Podcast, where intentional leadership creates lasting impact. Hi, I'm Jen Brown with my co-host Hugo Rodriguez, and we're diving into real leadership stories and practical insights to help you lead with clarity, courage, and connection. Because we believe great leadership creates positive ripples at work and in life. Hello to our listeners and viewers. I'm Jen Brown, the founder of Journey of Grace Coaching and a leadership coach, as well as a former U.S. diplomat, where I had the pleasure of serving with my good friend and colleague, Hugo Rodriguez.
Thank you, Jen. As Jen mentioned, my name is Hugo Rodriguez, also a former diplomat with 25 years experience developing leaders for challenges in some of the hardest places in the world. Today, I'm a leadership coach and a professor of practice in leadership, and I'm excited to share these leadership conversations with Jen. Jen, we have a guest today. What are we talking about?
We have a very special guest who was introduced to us by a colleague of ours, a former colleague of ours, Juliana Pereira. So Juliana is a former CMO with over 7 career pivots in her experience, in her life. She has served in senior roles at Gucci, P&G, Tiffany, in this academia sphere, and has an upcoming pivot as a co-author of a book called Pivot Quest. Juliana, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about career pivots. Talk about them. You've had a few.
Yes, I have. Thank you so much, Jen and Hugo, for having me. It is, as I say, I'm like a cat with many lives. I feel like many of them were not planned. Some of them were planned. But I'm really excited to be here today and to talk to you guys about something that is so relevant, especially now we're talking about the future of work, how everything is changing in the age of AI. But something that's really interesting, this has been for me, many years. Like I have 25 years of experience, and I look back and it really looks like completely different lives. I always say it's important to know where you come from in order to know where you're going. My mother's Colombian, my father's Portuguese. They met in New York. So I was born and raised in New York. And for me, like I studied in Boston. I always knew that I was passionate about communication. And that later becomes important because I think people who have pivoted as many times as I have, what you come to realize that it's not really about the next job. It's really about, finding a way back to yourself. No? And so for me, those pivots have meant that, okay, well, you study one thing, right? This is where we come from, right? You go to school, you study something, and that's supposed to be for the rest of your life. And that no longer do we have those, linear careers. And so for me, the first pivot occurred from New York. I worked in advertising. I worked at big agencies, BBDO and Y&R on big accounts, Procter & Gamble and Johnson and Super Bowl advertising. And after many years of just being burnt out, I decided I wanted to move actually countries. So my pivot was, not just a pivot in terms of, I just thought I was moving countries. And what it ended up being was that I moved to Spain and I had to completely reinvent myself because I couldn't find a job in what I was working in. So people thought I was either overqualified, either I was going to be asking for too much in terms of a salary. And so I ended up in the arena of a completely different thing, which was public relations for luxury fashion brands. And how did this happen? This was one of a very important piece of information for pivoters or people who are thinking to pivot is that it's not about what you know necessarily. It's a lot of times about who you know. And here's where, there's a big difference between networking and community, right? Building. And so when I got to Spain, I didn't have a community. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know one soul. And so it was really difficult to find that first opportunity. And what was interesting was that the only reason I got this interview was because somebody saw in me something I didn't see in myself. And at that point, it was that I spoke 3 languages. So that I spoke Spanish, I spoke Portuguese, and I spoke English. And it was for these luxury brands. And so I sort of like an Iberia role. And I kept on saying, but I don't know how to write a press release, but I just landed in Madrid. Like, I don't know any journalists. Like, what, are you sure you understand the difference between advertising and PR? And the founder of the company, he just looked at me and he's just like, it doesn't matter. He's just like, you'll figure out the rest of it. And it's about, you're going to be in 1 week. This was his line: in 1 week, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and drinks, and you'll know whoever you need to know. And we're here by your side to help you. And so that was the beginning of sort of landing in Madrid, and my first job with Gucci and Burberry. I started with Burberry account, and that was where the English came in. That was very important. And then 6 months later, they got the Gucci account, so I was leading up that. Then it turned into 1 year later. Of course, as an American in Madrid, I'm like, what about my annual review? And they're like, what? and so I was like, well, what I've done, what I could work on, what I could improve. And he's like, what do you want, more money? And I was just like, okay, that would be nice. But and so I realized they didn't really, this agency was very sort of account executive, assistant account executive. It had a bunch of accounts, but it was, the chief, honcho was the founder, and there wasn't much structure. And so I offered to grow. I said, well, you don't have anybody doing new business development. You don't have an agency director. And I kind of threw myself in there, and I said, okay, you have a lot of French brands and Italian brands and British brands, but you don't have any American brands. It's like, no, that's impossible. I'm like, why is that impossible? Let's go to El Corte Inglés, right, the department store, and see what brands are there that don't have flagships. And of course, back then, I was 26 years old. I don't know who I thought I was, but I think we're a bit more courageous back then. And I just picked up the phone and called, Tiffany, New York. And they're like, oh, actually, we are looking to open 2 new markets in Europe, and Madrid could be one. Okay, you can do a pitch. And we ended up pitching, and we ended up getting the account. And so then it was interesting because my next pivot comes because of that. So there, a headhunter called me and said, are you the person who's getting these American brands, into Madrid? And it was a luxury retail outlet that had 7 outlets in Europe and 3 in Asia. And they were looking for a head of marketing. And so then the story repeats itself again, because I'm like, but I've never done a marketing campaign in my life. And they're like, it doesn't matter, come to the interview. And that was sort of, again, going into something completely different, even though it's all under sort of the umbrella of communications, but completely different worlds. And so I was there for about 3 years, working in that marketing department. And then I decided that I wanted to leave corporate world, and I saw an opportunity in the market, to do, kind of like I had this entrepreneurial vein because my father had his own business, and I know the sacrifice that goes behind that. But I also, thought, why not? And it was I founded like a wellness kind of company. And this is really funny because I would walk around Madrid and I'm like, why is there no place to get a manicure or facial? And people, like my Spanish friends, would be like, no. You do that like when you get married. I'm like, what do you mean when you get married? It's like on every corner in New York. And there just was no culture. There was no culture of it. And so I was just like, okay. And because I came from luxury brands and I had, these connections already with the press, it was kind of like life was setting me up, for success in that sense. And it was the moment of bloggers. And so I opened, sort of a manicure, facial, wellness spa, and which became like a very big community of women. And so that also goes into another part of me, sort of entering that world of that it's not just a business. It was really a space, for people to connect. And because I had all the backgrounds of where I'd worked, it was really funny because you'd be getting a pedicure and you'd have like the head of like the Prado marketing sitting to your right, and you would have like Cartier, head of, PR to your left. And so I had that business for about 7 years, and it was a successful business. But what ended up happening is life. And I always say this as well, pivoting, as much as we think, career pivoting, sometimes we pivot because of life. I was burnt out in New York, and I changed because I wanted a better quality of life, so to come to Europe. And this pivot came because I was married with a son that was a year and a half old, and I was going through a divorce. And so I said, how do I have a business that's open Monday to Sunday? Because it was when we were allowed to open on Sundays, because that was another thing back then in Spain, nothing was open on Sundays. And so I was one of the few businesses that we were open, and I knew that it was a day where women usually can, have time to themselves. And so I said, how do I have a service business open Monday to Sunday with a 1.5-year-old getting divorced, which is a very tedious, long process in a country where I have no family, right? And so I didn't have any support system. And so I was very, I would say lucky, but I also think that we also produce our own luck, is that I had throughout these 7 years, one of my really good clients was L'Oreal. And L'Oreal had bought Essie, the nail polish brand, and they were looking for a flagship store. And so they asked me if I wanted to sell. And it came at the perfect time, but it's another nugget of gold that I will tell people, is that sometimes that we think, oh, great, okay, this all makes sense, the universe has aligned, and then everything crumbles, and you're like, okay, why did that happen? Right? There's always a reason why. And so I had the conversation with L'Oreal. It ended up falling through because they wanted me to stay there for 2 years, and I was like, I can't even stay here 2 months, right? Like with a 1.5-year-old and on my own. And so I had to say no. And those are was one of the hardest decisions of my life. But 2 weeks later, somebody walked in and he's like, do you remember me? And I was just like, I see a lot of people. And he's just like, I was in the boardroom of L'Oreal. And I was just like, oh, and he's just like, well, me and my partner were looking to buy a business. He's like, obviously I can't offer you what L'Oreal was offering you, but we're interested. So I ended up selling the business to them. So it's funny, how life works in the end. And this is where also the crazy, you sort of call it destiny or call it, whatever you want to call it, was that I did a small gathering for my VIP clients. And there was a woman who was getting married. And so she was there like every week. And when I did the gathering, I remember I was like, kind of saying goodbye to people, but I'm like, I'm not leaving the country. I'm staying, I'm here. And everyone was like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I was like, I don't know, right now, get divorced and see what I do with my 1.5-year-old. And this one woman that was a client, she's just like, oh, Juliana, you have to come over for dinner. And I was just like, but I'm not leaving, leaving. And she's just like, let's celebrate, when are you gonna, when's your last day? So let's say it was on a Friday. So I closed up the shop and I crossed the street because she literally lived in the building in front. And I end up going to her apartment, and there are these 3 gentlemen. And so one was her fiance and these other 2. And they keep saying, oh, half Colombian, half Portuguese, born and raised in New York. You're such an IE profile. And I was like, what is IE? Like, I had no idea. I had to go to the restroom and Google it. And it was a main, now today it's #1 like business school in Madrid and university. And I was sitting there with like the dean of the business school, which was her fiance. And they're like, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to, and so we just had, regular conversation. I ended up leaving and the next day she calls me up and she's just like, they want you to come to the campus. They're interested in, your sort of like entrepreneurial, background. The school is all about the entrepreneurial business, et cetera. And I was just like, really? And then she's like, yeah, what's your plan? What are you going to do? I'm like, I don't know, right now, just go sign this over and figure out what I'm going to do. And I remember that on the following Monday, I signed away my company, and then I went to the to their campus to have the interview. And they were looking for somebody. They had 160 different nationalities on campus, 10,000 students, and they were looking for somebody to start their campus life department. And so that was the next pivot, which was, I was like, academia, but I've never been in education. And they're like, it doesn't matter, like you've done way more difficult things, and you're going to start with a team of 2 people. And it was really interesting because I basically developed from scratch everything, like what is campus life, right? So there was no mascot. There was, like IE Day, the traditions, the clubs, women in business and the hackathons and we had 1,500 events a year. It was like insane. And after 3 years of doing that, they decided to create the first vertical campus with like a 50-story building. They said, okay, well, do you want to work on this project and figuring out, spaces and services and what the students need? And for it not to be a KPMG, but to be, actual campus where architect students talk to business school students, etc. And so I worked on that fascinating project for another 3 years. And then a headhunter called me, and again, it's, this is life, right? And it was just like, well, we're looking for a global CMO for a tech consultancy. And I was just like, tech. And this was like post-COVID. I was just like, that could be interesting, the future. So I did it. But then after a year and a half, I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, this is like, people with like, they're basically like with their headsets, if they even come to work, because everyone was remote. And just a completely different environment. It was a fascinating project as well, because it was this amazing entrepreneur that he had bought like 22 companies. And I had to, as marketing head, had to put that underneath an umbrella. But it just wasn't, I didn't feel like the passion that I felt of being, trying to develop a community and connected with people in that space. And that was the first time. And this is where I also, it's another golden nugget, which is we sometimes are so disconnected from ourselves that we don't really know what brings us energy. And, and what I saw very clearly at that point in time was, this is like sucking my energy. This is not bringing me energy. And when I was on that campus, I felt like I wanted to go to work every day, right? Like it wasn't work. It was, getting people together. It was creating, it was, learning from students. It was, them learning from me and from all my experiences. And so I wanted to do that, but I said, okay, how can I do this, but for companies? And that's sort of what my last pivot has been within the last 2.5 to 3 years, is that now I go into companies and I help them by creating think tanks, which is another way of doing create community. So companies that have B2B, and so a way of engaging their clients for thought leadership. And so what I do is I connect it with, like, let's say MIT Review in terms of doing a white paper, and then have that, then be a channel of communication. And so it's a different way of doing community building, but inside of companies, and has been, very rewarding. So this is, and this is all brings me to, I'm a cat with 8, different lives. And people, like my friends, joke because they call me up and they're like, if you ever need somebody, like Juliana's got to know them, because from like a CEO to like the acrobat at Cirque du Soleil. And I'm like, yep.
So there's so much that you said in there, and wow, what a career trajectory, right? A few things that totally stand out to me: using your community, building those connections. And what I heard you say a few times in there is, maybe, I'm not going to say confidence, but that, wow, but I don't do that. And somebody else seeing how those dots in your life connected you to be able to do the opportunity that was in front of you.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious, as you did those first couple pivots in particular, what did that feel like of, I'm stepping into something I haven't done before?
Yeah.
And you, right, you mentioned the confidence of being in your mid 20s versus perhaps later in life, when it's like, can I still do this?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, obviously, I mean, I'd be, lying if I was just like, oh yeah, I'm super confident. No, I was scared every single one, even my latest one of, being a, co-author of this book. I think the big difference is, maybe once you're in your 20s versus now closer to 50, is that, yeah, you should have that confidence, because you've sort of gone through all of this. But I think back then it was, what's the word, like they're going to say no, right? Like, what if Tiffany says no, and, they just don't want to open a flagship here, and that's it. It's not a big deal. But what I've come to realize is that in a pivot, there's basically 4 crises, right? So I think you have your identity crisis, right? It's kind of just like, okay, who am I? Like, this is what I've been defined by. All the people I've interviewed doctors and lawyers and people who've invested a lot in their careers. They're like, what, I'm going to throw this away, right? So it's just like, who am I if I'm not this, right? So you have kind of like that identity. Then you have like the social crisis, right? So like, will people accept me? Right? Will my family accept me? Will my friends accept me? Like, who do I look like? Right? If I'm not this that I've, created. And then you have a financial crisis, which is very different in your 20s than now with your, almost 50s, where you have a family and you have your bills to pay and so it's just like, can I even allow myself, to take this step and do this pivot? And then you have like the courage crisis, right? Which is, how do I muster up all this confidence and understand, and this is a big thing that I tell people, is you are not starting from scratch. You are starting from experience. You are starting, and I don't care if you just have one job or if you've done 2 internships. It's like you are starting from everything you already are. Right? Because you aren't just a job. You are a person before that. I always say, like, when people are like, I've been wondering about this lately. I'm like, who was my mom before she was my mom? Right? Like people are people before, right? So you are somebody before you have that title. You were somebody in high school, right? Before you went to college and had your, have that certificate that you have on the wall. So yeah, I think that when you do these pivots, and when I've gone through them, what I've realized is that it takes, and this goes back to like the research and these 100 people that I've seen, like I felt it within myself, but like I wanted to test this out and see if other people, if this was sort of a pattern. And the one thing that I found really fascinating is that everyone has pivoted because of, it's not a career event, it's a life event. It's because something in your life, right, has shifted. And that could be a divorce. That could be a, parent that died that made you reflect on something. That could be a move to a different country. It could be so many different things, but every single person that I interviewed, it was a life event that had happened. And then the second thing is that all of these people in the end, they were not looking for another job. They were looking to understand something about themselves. And I think, when I've spoken to serial pivoters, like I spoke to this woman that's 82 years old and had done 16 pivots, right? So like more experience than that is difficult to find. And in the end, it all is, you circling back to yourself, right? So you're circling back to, and I remember this expert that I interviewed in New York, amazing advice is that he's like, sometimes we're so disconnected that we don't know how to connect with ourselves. And he's just like, this is an easy exercise that you can have anybody do. So you sit on the floor in your room, let's say in your bedroom, you sit on the floor and you close your eyes and you think back to when you were between 8 and 10 years old, because that's a key moment in your life. And then imagine what was in your room. So like, were there baseball cards thrown on the floor? Were there, like, was your bike in the corner? Was there, what was there? And he was saying that that's such a key pieces of information that you can gather from there because that was your essence. Right. And so like, I think about back to myself and I remember I always, like, my parents had like the newspapers and like the magazines and like all this stuff. And so I remember always having cutouts. Like I would do like collages of stuff. And I would be like, oh, you're so creative, whatever, which came after. But that's kind of like where it came from. Like, I really loved going through all of these magazines and like all the articles and like seeing, kind of like the New York Times, it was weird because I had from Vogue to New York Times to, but just I had collages all over my room. And so I think, and he said that one of his clients that he, worked on and, helped and used this was really like, he had this flashback of like baseball cards. There was just baseball cards all over. And he's just like, my mom would be like, can you pick up your baseball? Like they were all over. And then he ended up this is kind of like the universe as well. He ended up going to like the garage or something of his parents and like finding baseball cards, and then quit his job and did like a huge company or whatever, based on this, on people exchanging baseball cards and whatever. And so he ended up fulfilling like and having a passionate and meaningful, for what his is, just from something that clicked, from back then. But it's so hard for us to get back there. And so sometimes we're lucky and you can have that, but a lot of people who pivot, it's just like, and I can speak to myself and to the research that I've done. It's kind of because you're a curious person. Most of it is because you have curiosity and you're not just satisfied with this is it. Like almost everyone I've interviewed, it's like they have ants in their pants, like 3 years in a job and you want to go to the next thing and you want to go to the next thing. And it's because it's something within yourself that you're trying to identify. And
so I think so much of what you said, oh my gosh, I want to explore. I want to go back to that 8 to 10 and play because now I'm very curious about that. But there's something that you said prior to that about the people you've researched and you researched over, you spoke with over 100 people in 25 countries. This book, right?
Yep.
And the importance of a life event being a trigger. I'm also curious though, what about when it's a transition, a pivot that maybe we didn't exactly choose? As Hugo and I were talking, we came from government. There's been a lot of change in government. We have, former colleagues who experienced a pivot. Hugo, what are your thoughts? And Juliana, I'd love for you to weigh in when that pivot isn't necessarily our own making.
There's so much here that's got my brain just churning. It's incredible. I'm glad you talked about the pivot back to yourself, because that's a classic coaching thing, right? We are looking as we coach people to get them to reflect on where the energy shifted. You also talked about how you are actually searching for something that brings you energy again. And a lot of our clients and a lot of our colleagues at the State Department and elsewhere in government have come to the realization that the work no longer brings them the energy. It's not that bright, shiny, exciting thing that it was. They don't look forward to going to work anymore. As coaches, trying to get them to reflect on what was the last thing that brought you that energy. So you really clearly kind of tied those things together. And the other thing that occurred to me as you were talking, when we define ourselves by the job we are doing now, we're creating an anchor that may slow us down into the future. So as you did your different pivots, you were thinking, well, I don't know anything about marketing. I don't know anything about PR because my current job is something totally different. And you have to let that role go and count on the fact that people, your connections, the people that can see you, they see what you bring. They're not looking for just the thing you used to do. They see the light that you can shine on something new and bring that in. So leveraging those contacts to open up the world for you. And, the thing that I often find when I'm talking to students who are looking for their first jobs and their first career moves, they think they have to have every qualification in that job description. And that's a wish list that some company dreamed up. They're never going to find a qualified candidate that hits every one of those boxes. And if you hit 3 out of 5, if you hit 6 out of 10, they want to talk to you because that might be the 6 they're looking for, right? And your bravery and sort of leaning into those new roles that you didn't exactly fit, but in fact, you had the skills to do very well, is such a good lesson. So thank you for all of that. I took so many notes and there's so much going on. I love what you said about community and the importance of community. And I'd love to get you to talk more about how that fuels effective organizations and what we as kind of the coaches to leaders, what we can do to help our clients appreciate the importance of community as they lead their organizations.
Yeah. Okay, a lot to unravel here. Just take two steps back. One thing that you discussed is about energy, right? And there's probably a lot of people out there who it is a forced pivot, right? And they're like, and now what do I do? And this is what I'm good at. And now how do I know what I'm good at? And that's where I ask people to stop and think about their CV in a different way. Don't think about that I am a marketing director, or that I am, somebody who worked at the embassy, or that I am, think about it in terms of like, what are your transferable skills? And that's like a word that now people are under, but it's much harder to actually take your CV and understand, how do I find out what my transferable skills are? And how can I use that language, right? That's the language that you have to start using, instead of being like, I'm a director of this, I'm a director. So imagine if you're in technology and you want to like pivot into, I don't know, to entertainment, right? It's a completely different industry. And so you have to use language that people are going to understand from either side. And so, in terms of thinking about your energy, like, okay, so now I'm forced into this. Okay, great. Okay, so this is where we make lemonade, right, out of lemons. And this is where it's kind of like you have to come halfway, and then the other part will end up coming as well. And I remember that I was at some point with a career redesign coach myself, because I was kind of like, I don't even know who I am anymore. Like, I've done so many different things that, and some could be forced, and some, because life events that happened, but I've never really stopped. Like, kind of opportunities came, but I've never really stopped to think, what is it that I want to do? And I remember her asking me, well, what brings you energy? And tears started rolling down my eyes, because I could not answer that. And I was just like, but what do you mean? I was just like, with my like type A person, I was like, what do you mean? Like, as in terms of like listening to music, like and she's just like, Juliana, what brings you energy? And I couldn't answer the question. And that's another thing that we also, like, another exercise that we have in the book is track your energy. And that might sound like ridiculous, but it actually works. So you take, let's say you have, I don't know, you can write it down, or if you have like on your phone notes or whatever, and every single day, something that brings you energy. And people are like, yeah, but I'm so clueless. Like, I have no idea. And so I always take my example, which is, for example, I would take the metro. And I always talk to, like, I don't know, if I like somebody's like coat or shoes or whatever, I talk to anyone. And so I'm an extrovert in that sense. And I remembered like getting out of the metro and being like, that made me feel good. And so I would write it down. And so after doing that, after 1 week, I started to see patterns. And people are like, well, how do you see a pattern from talking to a stranger to sitting down in a park bench? Like, I always would walk past this park all the time and like never have a second to stop. And one day when I was tracking all of this, I walked past and I actually smelled like these flowers. And I was just like, I have walked past this, I don't even know how many years, how many times, and I have never smelled this flower. And I forced myself to just stop. Right. And I realized the energy that just stopping and pausing and breathing something in, that's for free, that gives me. And so one part is, something can be forced upon you, but how you react to that, right, is what's in your power. And so is giving people tools to be able to navigate, because when we're like, oh, your passion, your purpose, okay, I don't even know what that is, right? Like, a lot of people are like, I have no idea. So being able to give people tools for that is super important. And then the second thing is, you just lost your job, right? You just lost your title. You just lost your identity in many cases. And so there is a mourning that happens with that. And for me, it's sort of like, okay, I got divorced, right? With a 1.5-year-old, lots of mourning there. It's like, but I had no time to mourn, because I have a 1.5-year-old and I have to get on with it. And not till years later do you realize, like, if you don't process that, it comes crashing down. The same thing happens with the career pivots. So if you had one identity and you had one community and you had a team of people that depended on you, and you met something, right? And then you shift and you go to something completely different. It's just like, and I love this woman in Argentina that I interviewed, pivot her like 6-7 times. I love the way that she explained it, because it was so visual. She's like, it's like a snake. It's like a snake sheds its skin. It doesn't become a new snake. It becomes more of itself. right? And she's just like, and it's kind of like that. It's like the shedding comes in that form of mourning, and you may leave some things. You may leave your title, you may leave a lot, but you don't leave the things that you learned there. Those, those are yours. The people, that may still continue to be in your life. And so there is that part of mourning that I think that a lot of us, we don't stop to do. And it's kind of like, I need to pay bills, I need to get on with my life, and I don't have the luxury to sort of mourn. And we should. And sometimes it could be a longer process, sometimes it doesn't have to be. But even if it's like taking a white sheet of paper and writing down, what did you feel like? Did you feel like, they didn't value you? Did you feel like, and then because months later you can look back at that, and that's important. Again, where were you and where are you now? And in terms of community, I always say that community is, one thing is networking. We come from very much a society where it's all like LinkedIn and how many contacts, or you go to a cocktail and you exchange, right, a card. And a few weeks ago, for example, I was, because I'm part of like all these different communities, being Portuguese and being Colombian, being American. And I was at this Portuguese fundraising thing. And I was sitting at a table, and it was like an ex-prime minister was there, and, a famous, how do you say, athlete was there, an Olympian. And there was, I don't know, a bunch of like, CEOs of companies, etc. And what I loved was that I got up from the table, and I didn't have one single business card from anybody, but I had like 5 news stories, right? And that what brought us together was we were talking about like, what's our favorite beach in Portugal, or where in Madrid do you have great Portuguese food, or where do you, and so I know that if the next day I go to LinkedIn or I try and find these people, I have a story, and that's so much more powerful than having a business card. And community works in the same way. Every human being on this planet, I always say, is looking for many things, but I think there are 2 basic things. One thing is, what can I give? What can I offer that is of like that only I can? And what, and and what can I receive, right? But it's about serving community in terms of giving a piece of yourself and receiving something in return, right? And so when it's transactional, it feels transactional. And we all know that. We've all been there. We've all had the email or the whatever, and you're like, oh, here's this person again asking me, whatever. And so isn't it much more lovely to be surrounded by, people that, and that's why I say, it's just like, that's why I know the acrobat from Cirque du Soleil and the CEO of whatever. It's because, and I remember now with the book, it's been something that's been so amazing, is that I go back to, imagine, in 2006. So when I got to Madrid and I was working in fashion, and the editor-in-chief of Vogue, which was like the Anna Wintour, right, of Spain, that has been there for however many years, so many years later, I saw her, and she's like, Juliana, we have to have a coffee, whatever. We sat, we had coffee, we reminisced. And she's just like, what I really liked about you? You always offered a story, but you never asked. You never like said, I want this cover, I need this article, you just offered, and that's it. And now with the book, what's interesting is the girl who was next to the cubicle across from me at BBDO, it was really funny because she was on M&Ms and I was on, Gillette razors, and I would give her razors for her boyfriend and she would give me candy, right? And we'd exchange. And I was just like, oh, okay. And I like looked her up on LinkedIn, and I wrote her, and she automatically replied. She's like, oh my God, Juliana, how are you? You have to, when you're here in the States, we have to, meet up. And I was like, oh, I saw that you're living in Boston. I'm going to Boston. And so we had a conversation. And what's really funny, it happened with my first boss at BBDO and with her, is that I get on the phone. They're like, you still have the same voice. I'm like, how's my voice going to change? But it's funny because we have that sort of, you don't talk to somebody in 20 years and then you hear, and it was like being back in that cubicle, with her. And it's crazy because everything I'm doing in Boston now, which I just reached out to say hi, and she's just like, I'm going to connect you with this person and with that person and with that person. And it's just like my whole launch in Boston is thanks to this one person that all I wanted was to have a coffee with her, when I was back in, in the States. So I thought I had left New York 20 years ago and my whole network was gone. And the beautiful thing also about this book has been realizing that my community was still there. No, and that's why
Yeah.
it's really important to build that. It's like not to build a LinkedIn, but
So
to build that.
if I could just underline that. So what you're saying is focus on what you can give, because you're investing and you don't know, like, if that ever pays off, doesn't matter. But it tends to pay off down the road, right? Like,
Yeah.
build your community in terms of the things you can do for other people without worrying about what's in it for you. And sure
Yep.
enough, the world turns on that, and it's there if you ever need it. It's really great.
Yep. Yep. And I think it really works that way. I mean, for me, it's been my case, and I know many people, and I'm telling you, I interviewed 100 pivoters, and most of the opportunities did not come via LinkedIn. Most of the opportunities, and this we know in terms of statistics, come from another person.
Yes,
And LinkedIn,
it's been my experience too. Go ahead, Jen.
It's a connecting platform, right? But it's not the be all end all there. But I'm very curious, in all of your research that you've done, and you have a co-author as well, right?
Yes. Yep.
So what surprised you in doing this?
Yeah. A lot of things, but I would say, I think that the first thing is that I thought I was researching like career transitions, and I really wasn't. I was researching what it means to be human during, the moments of change, right? Yeah. And so and I always say that I think that's what makes Pivot Quest special, because it's about that in between. It's about like that yuckiness or how we're feeling. It's about, yes, the courage, but maybe a courage, not the way that we think about it, but maybe it's just courage because you asked somebody for a coffee, right? And that was a really tough thing to do. Or you wrote somebody in LinkedIn who you thought would never write you back, and then they did. And so I always say, even for this book, like, I feel like I had to have courage. I was just like, there's no way I'm going to get these endorsements, and who's going to, what expert is going to pick up the phone? And I think a lot of people think that way, and they get stuck and in that fear. Laurie Santos of the Happiness Lab, like, actually answered me, and I actually got an interview out of her. I was just like, I never thought that was going to happen. Or Tal Ben-Shahar, right? Of Harvard, of like the #1 happiness, whatever guru. And people are like, how did you do that? I was just like, I just sent them a LinkedIn, right? Like
in addition to your own pivots, right? You have been a TEDx speaker, you have written for Harvard Business Review. So that courage of doing hard things.
Yeah. But I always say, this is another tip I give people, is I set not a New Year's resolution. I set every year something like I'm really scared to do, and like do it. And so like 3 years ago, that was the book, right? And 1 year it was the TEDx, and another year was, writing the article for HBR. And so I never knew that all of those little steps, right, of conquering my own fear. It's kind of like when you go on the roller coaster that you really hate, but it's like, okay, you're going to go on a roller coaster screaming at the top of your lungs, and what is that going to do for you? Okay, maybe you get everything out that you need to get out, but actually doing these steps, I never knew that it was building a path towards this, right? And I think that's the beautiful part of life, is that the rewards are there, and we talk about success in many different ways. But for me, success, after years and pivots and everything, is being coherent in what I say, what I do, and what I think is aligned. And I think that's really hard as human beings for us to do. And I think if we challenge ourselves like that, whether it's once a year, whether it's, being really scared to ask, somebody at work, that you admire, to grab lunch one day, or, or somebody who you've been following on LinkedIn and you love the newsletter that they write every week or whatever, and ask a question, or it takes so little, but it takes so much. And again, I'm an extrovert. So, and I've had many people on my different teams throughout the years who are introverts and that work in a completely different way. But But I think regardless, we're all human. And there's one thing which I've really noticed with this book is everyone wants to share their story, and if you reach out to anybody, asking for help, 99.9, I mean, I've had very few people say no, I mean, at most, I don't think anybody, like even of all the experts, maybe it took like 16 messages, to get through, but I got through. So, and that there goes also the other part, which is you can't just give up. Right. And so, and this is where also you figure out if it's really your passion and you have energy for it or not.
Can I ask two questions? And this semester, as I get started planning my classes, the importance of connection and the importance of network really comes up for me. And it's something that young people in college, they don't necessarily have a concept for how you approach it. You've clearly done both with intentionality and also just in the nature of your business, a really amazing job of networking. The first question is, what advice would you give to a 20-year-old college student about getting out there and building that network? Second question is completely unrelated. Well, I should say it's partially unrelated. How do you get so much done in your day? What does your day look like? How do you stack all of these things that you are doing? I would just love some insight into what a day in Juliana's life looks like.
Yeah, it's quite insane. But okay, so starting with the first question, what I would tell a person who's in the especially like if they're a university or they're concerned with getting a job. Right. It's not how we used to get a job, and it's not for, we want the major company and we want the logo and whatever. But they're looking to get a job, right. And to be independent. And my first thing is that your possibilities multiply by connecting with people, and connecting with people is not a platform, right? Like I always say, have like a live conversation. And so those conversations place you in a room where you are seen in a different way, and you realize that you're placed in a room in a different way. And so that's very important at that age. Like they may not realize it, but being able for them to understand that, great, so you have 1,000 people on LinkedIn. What does that mean? Are any of them going to give you a job tomorrow? So how many coffees have you gone to have? How many network events, that every town has, every city has tons of networking events, every like meetup groups, and so many different ways of connecting with people. And I always tell, and I say this to young people as well. It's just like, sometimes if you know what gives you energy, so let's say I like hiking, or whatever. I've gotten great opportunities through actually just doing something I like and going and meeting strangers. Like I remember in Madrid, I live in the city. I said, I want to I made that as a goal. I want to be more connected, with nature. And so I have like the weekends, like I don't have my son I have him every other weekend. I was like, I'm going to go hiking. And so I got on a bus with like 10 different strangers, a person from China, a person from France, a person from here, from there, and through a meetup group. And I found amazing friends, but also like business opportunities. So the number one thing is, it's not, I think young people, and I've learned so much because also being in academia and being surrounded, by them, I think they view the world obviously in a very different way. And these are very different times, but and that's one thing that worries me, is that not just like the skills, the critical thinking and like all of this, that, they're not sitting in a boardroom. They're not going to sit in a boardroom and see what we saw with our bosses, right? They're not going to, be by the water cooler or go down to lunch with 7 of their friends from work and so I think we really have to help them. And I think one of the ways is like pushing them towards understanding that importance of community. And it doesn't have to be necessarily business, right? It doesn't, because sometimes they don't like thinking that way. So I would say that. And in terms of my day, it's very, how do I say? I have multiple tabs open like all the time. People look at my computer and they're like, I don't even understand how you do it. But I always say that I grew up within three cultures, right? And even though I was in New York, I grew up, my parents were like, you are speaking to your grandparents. So I spoke Spanish to my mom and Portuguese to my dad before I spoke English, which was when I went to school. And I lived those cultures in the sense of I never went to camp in my life. I always came to Portugal for the summer, and I was in Christmas in Colombia, and I ate the food. Like I was the kid who had like the smelly lunchbox, and that like I would have like duck and fish and like all these things that people like would come over for. I remember people would come over for like a play date, and like their parents would drive up, like to the driveway, and they would say, mom, you've got to come in and see what they're eating, right? And it would be because like the whole fish would be there, right? The whole fish.
Right.
And so it was just like fascinating to them that the whole fish was like there.
Right.
And so I was that kid, right? And I remember since I was really small, like being at a table where maybe I had relatives from that didn't speak the same language. And so I would be translating, right? And I would be, within this like whirlwind. And I've always just managed a lot of things at the same time. I think I've, and I wouldn't say I'm like super organized. I am very, very organized, but I've learned to be less of a perfectionist. Like I was very much, it has to be done this way. It has to, because I think that flexibility is so important. So important. I would say after curiosity, I would say flexibility, because life is going to give you curveballs, and because things are not going to pan out as you expected. And because, my TED talk that I did, surprised a lot of people. Like in the sense that like, I remember one of my jobs in New York, and that was one of the triggers of, my godmother had passed away, my mom's sister, unexpectedly. It was Super Bowl Sunday. Imagine I was in advertising. I tried to reach my boss. I couldn't reach my boss. And I ended up going to the funeral 24 hours. Like I was there. I flew the day of the funeral and flew back the next day, and I got fired from my job because I didn't have authorization from my boss. So I learned at a very young age, and that was like I was 24, 25, that life's unfair. And sometimes, these things are going to happen, and you're going to have to roll with the punches. And that's not always easy. And so the more flexible you can be. And I was the kid that my mom was just like, we're going to have pizza tonight. And it didn't happen. And I'd freak out, right? So, it was like, it had to happen. And so I've come a long way, and it's a process, but that adaptability, that everyone's talking about is really, really fundamental.
I love it. And I feel like we could talk all day on this topic, and your experiences, your research, just so much that you have brought in. I know Pivot Quest is coming out August 25th, right?
Yes. Very exciting.
Okay. And we will certainly include links in the show notes here, but tell us a little bit about how we find it.
Yeah,
and what's on deck for you. Yeah,
definitely. So, yes, very exciting time. So I'm headed to New York. I'm going to be there as of the 17th of August, and we have different events lined up. I can also send you the links to the events that are open in New York and Boston. And the book is available on Barnes and Nobles or Amazon. It's in different places. I can also send you those links so you can include them. Yeah. And we wanted to not have the typical author events. We're going to be at Barnes and Nobles on Fifth Avenue. We're going to be in Barnes and Nobles also in Boston. We're doing an amazing event also at another bookshop, which I love, which is called Hummingbird in Boston. We're doing in New York in Soho at a spot called Bibliothèque, which is a wine and bookstore, also an event. And then also, for example, in Bang & Olufsen on their Madison Avenue, we're doing an event there as well. So we really wanted to sort of have different spaces to be able to cater to, younger audiences, older audiences. I'm even doing an event at, which I love, it's a shoe brand called Flabellus. They're a Spanish shoe brand. And I heard the founder talk. I went to this entrepreneur summit, and I heard the founder tell her story. And I was like, oh my God, we need to do something. And she studied law, and then And she decided she didn't want to do that. She went to London Business School, ended up working in like SaaS tech company. And then during COVID was just like, started designing like shoes, like took a typical Spanish shoe with like an Italian type shoe and did a mix. And now is in like 60 something countries, like 5 years later, has her like store in Soho, and an amazing, pivot story. And so I'm doing something with her and for her, like, women community at the Soho shop. So it's incredible how you find pivoters everywhere and anywhere, and that it's such an inspiring story. And I think we have heard so much negative press that, and we have all these, how many people, 50,000 people fired from here and 30,000 from here, and a whole department out here. And that, I think we need to hear some more positive stories. And so I think that's what I hope Pivot Quest brings, that it's not just inspirational, aspirational stories, which there are, of these pivoters from all over the world, but it's also like a practical guidebook. So we all, apart from the book, we created a workbook as well, which people can download. And so for those people who are navigating, who maybe had that forced pivot and are navigating or want to deep dive into it and kind of like need that push in terms of, okay, what exercises, how can I find out my energy? How can I find out, what my transferable skills are? How can I find out if I'm even ready for a pivot? Because sometimes people think that they're ready and they're not. And sometimes people have been forced to pivot, and this one person that I interviewed, which I really liked, from California, she was forced to pivot twice. And I love her story because it's like the first time she like bootstrapped, she sent out thousands of CVs, like did everything. It was like forcing things. Yeah. And the second time she's like, you know what? I'm going to like backpack through, the LATAM, and I'm going to like go back and find my roots, because she's Latin American, and I'm going to like teach Spanish, I don't know, to people, and English over there and Spanish over here. And I'm just going to figure it out. And her story is amazing because it's just like in record time, I found something, and I found something better. I found something that connects with me more. And so that's what I hope that, Pivot Quest brings to people, is that, no, what you study does not mean you're going to do that the rest of your life, first of all, so that young people understand that. And the years I was in academia, that was my, my keynote every single time was to look at me, like, you don't necessarily have to do that for the rest of your life. And second of all, that you're not going to get it right, maybe the first time or the second time. Here's the map and the tools I wish I would have had, right? And that's what I'm hoping that we give back. And that was the reason, to do this book, was sort of, it's kind of when you have kids and you want to, save them from, and they have to experience it, right? They have to experience it, but still your hand is there just in case. And so this is kind of like our hand is here just in case, and our community is here as well. And I'm hoping to gather more and more pivoters, because every single person I interviewed is like, if anyone is going through it, I'm more than happy to mentor, which is amazing to hear as well.
Truly. And I'm excited. I've ordered my copy. Cannot wait to read this. I have gone through my own, and it's still a work in progress, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm really taking from all of this is the hope, the positivity, the community that is there as support of going through it, the freedom also.
Yeah. No, there's a huge freedom that comes to it from it. And also I have to say another thing is that I interviewed this one woman who job 9 to 5, whatever, didn't like what she was doing. And she always had this hobby, like she loved astrology. And so she would like learn like every month a new card and all this stuff. And it wasn't until like everyone told her she was like insane. They're like, what are you going to quit your day job to like, read cards and like do? And she's just like, it wasn't until I went online and I went into a community, of people who do astrology and all this stuff and readings, and that I actually saw the possibility of, the financial stability that these people had, that they were passionate about what they were doing. And so a lot of times we think our friends and our family are the ones who are going to be like the cheerleaders there, and they're not, right? And that's okay. And that's another reason for why we need to tap into these communities and know that if you're lucky enough to be like, I'm really passionate about this, or I really like this, you can test, right? Like that's part of the framework that we have, is just like, there's a part of like discovery, and then there's a part of also testing, right? And so you don't have to jump into something, right away. You can test things out. And that's why those conversations are really important as well, because there's different ways of testing. You can enter a community, just start chatting with people, but you can, somebody who you like to follow on LinkedIn and reach out, and you don't know if they're going to say, yes, let's have a 10-minute virtual coffee.
Right. Exactly. I love this, Juliana. Thank you so much for sharing your story, the story behind the quest, and the hope that's out there. So we will certainly include all of these links in the show notes, and wish you the best of luck with the launch.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, for having me, and also all the best of luck in your pivots that you're going through. And I hope you also join the pivot community, and who knows, maybe one day you'll mentor somebody through theirs. So
you never know the possibilities.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Juliana.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Ripple Effect Leadership Podcast. If this episode sparked an insight or reminded you of someone, please share it and help forward the ripple. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review so more leaders can find their way here. You can find us on LinkedIn at Jen Brown-Coach and at HF Rodriguez Jr., and more leadership content and coaching tools at journeyofgracecoaching.com. A quick heads up before you go. This podcast and all content shared by Ripple Effect Leadership is for informational and educational purposes only. The opinions and characterizations in this podcast are our own and do not necessarily represent the U.S. government. This podcast is not a substitute for mental health treatment or professional medical advice. If you are struggling, we encourage you to reach out to a licensed mental health provider or call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You don't have to do this alone.